David.
Hi, thank you very much for all being here. So a bit of introduction. So yeah, I'm David Smith. I'm a maintainer of Django Crispy Forms, and I've been contributing to Django itself since 2020. And through that work, I've become a member of Django's triage and review team. This is the team that helps progress PRs to Django itself. And just during this time, it's just wonderful. The community, really supportive. I just think it's amazing that so many people can gather around a tool and organize events like this. It's really great. I'm Smith DC1 at GitHub and David Smith at fosterdon.org. So today, what are we going to cover? We'll start talking about the anatomy of a form, the different parts that make up a Django form, and the different words that Django uses to describe those elements. We'll then take an example form and see how we can ease the form rendering of that using the new features that we added during the Django 4 series. And one of the questions that we've been asked off the back of this is, so with all these new features, do I still need my third-party library? Do I still need to use Crispy Forms? So we'll have a look at that. And then towards the end, we'll have a look towards the future and see what features might be added in the future and what else we could think about. So let's go. So we'll start off with a small sample form. So maybe it's a contact form where we want to collect the first name and last name, and maybe the day that you want to book an appointment for. So we create our form by subclassing Django's forms.form, and there we can define our fields. So we've got a first name and last name field, which are both character fields, and our day field, which is a choice field there. And if we just call string on that form, it'll be rendered in a template. And we'll get the whole form, including all the fields and all the inputs and all the widgets. Diving down to the next layer down, we have fields. So a form can have many fields. And just looking at that day field here, we have a choice field, which has choices. And we've also defined a custom widget here. So we want it to be a checkbox field so people can select different days that they may want to book an appointment for. So when we render that in our template, that field becomes the label suffix, which is by default the colon, and the widget, so those input elements. And one thing to be aware of is that the field that we define on our form becomes a bound field when we render it in our template. This is something that took me a little while to realize, and when the penny dropped, it really opened things up for me. So Django's definition of a bound field is a field plus data. So a good example of this is maybe a user submits their form, and it's invalid. So we want to render that form again with the errors in those previously submitted values. We don't know those when we're defining the field on our form. We only know about those at render time. And then finally, we have our widget. So a widget is Django's representation of a HTML input element. Each field has a default widget, which you can customize per field. So here we've customized the widget for the choice field to be that checkbox input that we saw. So the widget is just those input elements. And for choice widgets, you have a concept of subwidgets to give you each option within that overall widget. So our first name and last name, the widget is just the input box, but for this choice widget, it's the collection of the parts. So by default, when we call string on our form, we'll have something that looks like this. And this is a form that's rendered in table tags. That's the default that Django currently ships with. That may not be what your project needs. So historically, Django's shipped another couple of options. So as UL and as P for rendering the form as an unstructured, unordered list or as paragraph tags. Probably the as P is probably the most popular of these. And the accessibility team reviewed the styles that Django ships with a little while ago. Mainly Thibaut, who's running the workshop next door. And the view was from an accessibility perspective, none of these styles are really that suitable and accessible for screen reader users. And the recommendation from the accessibility team was to introduce a new template that renders the forms in div tags. So in Django 4.1, we introduced as div template with the associated methods. So from Django 4.1, you can call as div, and that's got the improved accessibility features. So it renders, it implements field sets and legends to relate group-related inputs. So here we've got those checkboxes grouped, so they're easier for screen reader users to navigate. At this point, there was some discussion about these, the older methods. Should we keep those around? Should we remove them because they're not really recommended? And after a bit of discussion, we came to the conclusion that while they're not recommended, we won't remove them from the core Django library. But in the documentation, we'll recommend the as div. So all the docs in Django will now use as div for its examples. And it will recommend those over the traditional styles. So Django wants to ship sensible defaults. So as div will become the default in Django 5.0. And we've deprecated the old style. So to ease transition, there's a transitional renderer that got introduced in Django 4.1. And you can implement this by, in your settings.py file, setting the form renderer setting to that transitional renderer. And if you need to retain the previous behavior of it being rendered as a table, you can create a custom form renderer, setting the form template name and the form set template name settings to those template names directly. So by default, Django will ship as div template, and maybe you can style those directly and just use the out-of-the-box template. So yesterday, Carlton talked about Neapolitan. So I think that project is using the as div templates that are straight out the box and just styling those using the Tailwind classes. But maybe you need a bit more customizability. Maybe, for example, the requirement is to have a bit of margin between each of those fields. And Django gives us lots of flexibility to unpack each of the elements that make up our forms. So here we've got an example where we do exactly this. We've got a bit of margin between each of our elements. And we can access each bound field on our form through a dotted name attribute. So form.lastname gives us the bound field for the last name field on that form. And that bound field knows everything that you need to know about rendering a field in Django. So we're able to call the label tag to give us the label, errors for errors, and if we call string directly on the field itself, that actually gives us the field's widget, so the input element there. So we can do that for the last name and the first name. But for that day, we need to do something a little bit different because we need to implement field set and legend tags. So we can write those out ourselves in our template, and maybe we want to add a bit of help text as well at this point to give a prompt to the users of what they should be doing. So this is great. We can really customize the form layout in our project, but it's quite verbose. I think folk would just want to call form to render their form. So let's see how we can improve this. So the first thing I would recommend folk do is use all the field arguments. So you can set help text and labels and label suffixes on your field in your form definition. So here we can take that custom logic that's currently sitting in our template and define it on the field instead. And then in our template, we can access that through accessing the help text attribute on that bound field instead. So we're starting to generalize the template logic. So this has been around for some time. This is not new capability, but what is new in Django 4.1, we introduced the legend tag. So traditionally, there's a label tag, which will render your field label in label tags. But for field sets, we need to do the same thing, but in legend tags. So this got added in 4.1. Those that are kind of eagle-eyed and want to see will go, that's great, but what about that field set? What can we do about that? So we introduced a use field set method in Django 4.1, and that's available on the bound field. And what this does, it looks at the widget that's defined on that field and works out if that's a widget that needs to implement field and legend to relate those inputs together. So if you need to use the field set, then render it with a field set and a legend tag. Otherwise, we can just use the traditional label tag. All of the default widgets that come with Django itself have this setting set where required, but maybe if you've got a custom widget, you may need to just review that attribute on your widget to make sure people can make use of that in their forms. So now we're just starting to get somewhere where we can, we've generalized the template logic. And rather than writing out each field individually and each element on each field, we can instead loop over each field in our form and render each field in exactly the same way. So suddenly we can shrink the amount of logic that we've got in our templates to render our form. And one tip here is that Django will loop over those fields in your form in the same order that they're defined on your form or your model. But maybe in your HTML, you want them ordered in a different way. So you can use the field order attribute on your form and be able to customize the order that those are rendered in. So you can still make use of looping over the fields. So this is great. We've now got a shorter form logic, but we've still got to write that everywhere. And maybe we've got the same form in multiple pages in our project. We just want to get back to writing form. So what can we do? We can extract that form logic into its own template, and Django 4.0 switch form rendering to use the template engine. So all we need to do is define the template name on our form, and now when we call string on our form, it'll use that template name to render that form. Also in Django 4.0, You're able to customize that template on a per instance. So maybe you have a view, and depending on some logic that's in your view, you may want to render that form with a different template. So you're able to call the render method directly on the form and provide it with a template name directly. So at this point, you're able to define a template for your form and use that per instance or per form. But maybe you've got a form template now that you can use for every form in your project. You would still have to define that template name on every form in your project. So in Django 4.1, we added the ability to set a site-wide form template. And the way this works is you create a custom form renderer, and you can define the form template name site-wide on this form renderer, and it also works for form sets as well. So here we create a custom form renderer by subclassing the template setting and set the location of those templates on those settings, and in our settings.py file, give it the location of that custom form renderer. So now we can set a site-wide template on the form renderer in our settings. We can override that on a per form basis by defining the template name on the form, or we can define it per instance in our view. So just to recap the first part of the talk. Step 1, move as much logic as you can out of the template onto your form. Step 2, use new features to help ease writing of the template logic, so the legend tag and the use field sets. Loop over those fields to reduce repetition, and then use those templates throughout your project. One final thing is that the switch to template rendering goes even deeper. There's an ability to customize the template for the labels using the template name attribute on your form, and also customize how errors are rendered by defining a custom error class and using that on your form as well. So now I can set templates on my form. Do I still need Crispy Forms? Do I still need my third-party package? I think it depends. So I'll talk about Crispy Forms because I know a bit more about Crispy Forms. So Crispy Forms comes with some additional features that may be useful. So you can define your form layout in Python code. It's a little bit crazy, but folks seem to like it. So rather than writing out all your template logic in HTML, here we're able to have two inputs side by side, so maybe name and email in 2 columns, and they're on the same row. And we can write that in Python code. And Crispy Forms will render that using the templates that are assigned to each of those classes. You can do dynamic form layouts, so you can pick part of a form and you can update the attributes on part of that form. You could select all of the widgets of a certain type. So here we can select all of the password widgets on our form and just add certain classes on that form. And finally, the template packs. These are really powerful. So for the Bootstrap template packs, they come with lots of additional custom layout objects. So you can define modals, Bootstrap floating fields, Bootstrap alerts, accordions, and so on. And you can build out your form using these Bootstrap components in using that layout structure that we saw above. So you can get quite a lot of template logic a lot easier using these components. One other feature that I find quite useful, and this is shared both by Django widget tweaks and crispy forms, is the ability to add CSS classes to your widget in template logic. So of course you can define the classes for your widget. So by defining a attrs dict on your widget that's on your field, that's on your form. But maybe you don't know what class you need to add at that point. So in this example at the bottom, we might have a bootstrap form, and we need to add the isInvalid class, so we get the red box around the input field and highlights the error text in red as well. We only know that once the validation logic has been run on that form. So once that field is bound, so here we can say, if the field has an error, then add the classes required to style that field as an error. Otherwise, we can just render the default styles. This is something that's available in these third-party packages, but I'm not aware of a way in Django itself to be able to add CSS classes on the fly. Maybe you could do it in your view. Again, Carlton was talking yesterday about having kind of similar concepts grouped together. I'm not sure that adding CSS classes in views is a good answer. I'd rather see CSS classes in the template, because I see CSS classes and HTML as kind of being the same thing. And finally, some of the template logic can get quite complex. You won't be able to read that, but that's kind of deliberate. This is just the field template from the Bootstrap template pack. And by the way, this doesn't cover checkboxes or radios, all file fields. These are all their own templates as well. So some of the Bootstrap logic can get quite complex, because depending on what type you have, it's not just the classes that change, it's also the structure of the HTML itself as well. So, what about the future? So far, we've talked about treating each field in the form exactly the same, looping over them one by one. But maybe somebody comes along and goes, that's great, I really love this form, but could you just put the first name and last name next to each other rather than underneath each other? Suddenly, all that hard work will be undone. You'll have to maybe write something like this, which unpacks each of those elements, so you can put maybe the email and the password fields inside two divs for the column, and those nested within a row. This is much more difficult to maintain. Maybe what we would like is make that bound field renderable. So rather than the form, we're able to render the field. So here we have an asField group method on the bound field, and that renders the bound field with its label, its errors, its help text, and so on. And this is, I believe, much more manageable of laying out the fields on your form. Again, I'm going to refer to Carlton's talk again yesterday. He was talking about using HTMX, and maybe we just want to render a field on its own rather than the whole form. This would be a template just for a field. So we've added this feature in Django 5.0. So you'll be able to define this in a similar sort of way as the other templates. So field template name on your form renderer for site-wide, and using the template name argument when you define your field on your form for per field templates as well. Anything else? This one's a little bit out there, but something that we discussed is calling string on field actually gives you the widget rather than the field, but this has literally been like it forever. So it would be quite a breaking change. It would probably need a really strong consensus among the community to change this at this point in time. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Great. So I think we have time for a few questions. Anybody has got a question? There's 2 microphones to the left and to the right, or the other way around, and there's one walking around.
Thanks for the talk. I'm wondering if you change something project-wide, what will happen with the admin interface? Are we overriding everything there, or are there still, will we get then a bootstrap template in the admin all of a sudden, or how does this work?
Yeah, good question. So the admin templates are quite bespoke and custom to use the admin, I guess, classes in the admin site. I've looked at, can we use some of these features in the admin? I'm not quite sure it's so simple given the complexity of the admin templates.
There's one more question here.
Thank you. I'm just wondering, from a talk I saw the other day about excessive use of ARIA labels in Django forms by default, is that getting better now?
Yeah, good question. I can't quite remember where we got to, but there's definitely a couple of tickets open to add those for things like errors and help text, and we've made some improvements to the use of the for labels to link the inputs and the labels together.
So, yeah, they're available, but they're not like overused by default. That was the concern I think expressed.
Yeah, let's have a chat.
Okay, I'll look into it. So, thank you.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, David, especially. Great talk.